Chapters 14 and 15 of Book 3 of Pieces of Eight by Richard Le Gallienne. This is recorded to celebrate the 8th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 14, in which I lose my way. I stood a full minute with the astonishing paper in my hand, too stunned to speak or move. It seemed too incredible an outrage to realize. Then a torrent of feeling swept over me. Wild fear for her I loved, and impotent fury against the miscreant who had dared even to conceive so foul a sacrilege. To think of her beauty subject to such a coarse ruffianism! I pictured her bound and gagged and carried along through the brush in the bestial grasp of filthy negroes, and it seemed as though my brain would burst at the thought. "The audacity of the fellow!" exclaimed the king, who was the first to recover. "But Calypso!" I cried. The king laid his hand on my shoulder reassuringly. "Don't be afraid for her," he said. "I know my daughter." "But I love her!" I cried, thus blurting out in my anguish what I had designed to reveal in some tranquil chosen hour. "I've loved her for 20 years," said the king, exasperatingly calm. "Jack Harkaway can take care of himself." I was not even astonished at the time. "But something must be done!" I cried. "I will go to the commandant at once, and rouse the settlement. Give me a lantern!" I called to one of the negroes, who by this time had come up to us, and were standing around in a terrified group. I waited only for it to be lit, and then, without a word, dashed wildly into the forest. "Hadn't you better take someone with you?" I heard the king call after me, but I was too distraught to reply, plunging head foremost through the tangled darkness, my brain boiling like a cauldron with anger and 1,000 fears, and my heart stung too with wild unreasoning remorse. After all, it was my doing. "To think, to think, to think!" I cried aloud, leaving the rest unspoken. I meant that it had all come of my insensate pursuit of that filthy treasure, when all the time the only treasure I coveted was Calypso herself. Poor old ignorant Tom had been right after all. Nothing good came of such enterprises. There was a curse upon them from the beginning. And then, as I thought of Tobias, my body shook so that I could hardly keep on walking. And the next minute my hatred of him so nerved me up again that I ran on through the brush, like a madman, my clothes clutched at by the devilish vines and torn at every yard. I fled past the scene of our excavations, looking more haunted than ever in the flashing gleam of the lantern. With an oath I left them behind, as the accursed cause of all this evil. But I cannot have gone by them many yards, when suddenly I felt the ground giving way beneath me with a violent jerk. My arms went up in a wild effort to save myself, and then, in a panic of fright, I felt myself shooting downwards as one might fall down the shaft of a mine. Vainly I clutched at rocky walls as I sped down in the earth-smelling darkness. I seemed to be falling forever, and for a moment my head cleared and I had time to think of the crash that was coming at the end of my fall. A crash which, I said to myself, must mean death. It came with sudden crunching pain, a swift tightening round my heart as though black ropes were being lashed tightly about it, squeezing out my breath. Then entire blackness engulfed me, and I knew no more. How long I lay there in the darkness I cannot tell. All I remember is my suddenly opening my eyes on intense blackness, and vaguely wondering where I was. My head felt strangely clear and alive, but for a moment I could remember nothing. I was conscious only of a strong earthy smell, and my eyes felt so keen that, as the phrase goes, they seemed to make the darkness visible. They seemed, too, to see themselves as rings of light in the darkness. My head, too, seemed entirely detached from my body, of which, so far, I was unconscious. But presently the realization of it returned, and involuntarily I tried to move, to find, with a sort of indifferent mild surprise, that it was impossible. So there I lay, oddly content in the dark, the pungent smell of the earth my only sensation, and my head uselessly clear. Then, bit by bit, it all came back to me, like returning circulation in a numbed limb, but as yet dreamily, as something long ago and far away. Then I found myself partly risen, leaning on my elbow, and looking about in the nothingness. Then feeling seemed slowly to be coming back to the rest of me. My head was no longer isolated. It was part of a heavy something that lay inert on the ground, and was beginning to feel numbly, to ache dully. Then I found that I could move one of my legs, then the other, and eventually with a mighty effort I could almost raise myself. But for a moment I had to fall back. The remembrance of what had happened began to grow in force and keenness, and of a sudden the thought of Calypso smote me like a sword. Spurred to desperate effort, I stood up on the instant, and leaned against a rocky wall. Miracle of miracles! I could stand! I was not dead, after all! I was not, indeed, so far as I could tell, seriously hurt. Badly bruised, of course, but no bones broken. It seemed incredible, but it was so. The realization made me feel weak again, and I sat down with my back propped up against the rock, and waited for more strength. Slowly my thoughts fumbled around the situation. Then, as by force of habit, my hand went to my pocket. God be praised! I had matches, and I cried with thankfulness out of very weakness. But I still sat on in the dark for a while. I felt very tired. After thinking about it for a long time, I took out my precious matchbox, which unconsciously I had been hugging with my hand, and struck a light, looking about me in a dazed fashion. The match burnt down to my fingers, and I threw it away as the flame stung me. I had seen something of my surroundings, enough to last my tired brain for a minute or two. I was at the bottom of a sort of crevasse, a narrow cleft in the rocks which continued on in a slanting downward chasm into the darkness. It was a natural corridor, with a floor of white sand. The sand had accounted for my coming off without any broken bones. After another minute or two, I struck another match, and lo, another miracle! There was my lantern lying beside me. The glass of it was broken, but that was of no matter. As I lit the wick, my hopes leapt up with the flame. At the worst, I had light. Lux in tenebris. I seemed to hear the voice of the king, inextinguishably gay, and at the thought of him, my inertia passed. What could he be thinking? His daughter spirited away, and now I too mysteriously vanished. What was happening up there all this time? Up there? How far was it to up there? How far had I fallen? All about me was so terribly still and shut away, I could believe myself at the very centre of the earth, and it seemed ages ago, eons of time since I had last seen the king. What time was it? I felt for my watch. I found nothing but the wreck of it. It was the only thing that had suffered. It was smashed to smithereens. Then I moved myself again, and taking up the lantern, raised it aloft. But the chasm down which I had fallen went up and up in a slanting direction, and lost itself in darkness. Bringing the lantern down to the level again, I examined the rock corridor. Behind me, as before me, it continued, a long deep fissure splitting its way through the earth. I limped my way along some yards of the section that lay before me, but it seemed to me that it was growing narrower as it went on, as though it were coming to an end, and indeed after a while I came to a place too narrow for me to pass. I swung my lantern aloft, seeking the possibilities of a climb, but everywhere it was sheer, without a ledge or protuberance of any kind to take advantage of, and it was utterly devoid of vegetation, not a sign of a friendly shrub or root to hold by. So I turned back to try my luck in the other direction. But first I shouted and shouted with all my might. I could not be far away from the ruins, and there was a chance of someone hearing me. However, I had little faith in my effort, and was too tired to keep it up, so I turned with my lantern towards the other end of the corridor. And here it was easy going, along a gently graded descent, covered, as I have said, with white sand, in which shells were here and there embedded. My heart beat wildly. Perhaps I had only to walk on a little further to come out on the sea, for certainly the sea had been once, whether or not it came up there any more. Vain hope, for when I had followed the corridor some 50 yards or so, it suddenly widened out for a few yards into something of a cavern, and then as suddenly narrowed into a mere slit, and so came to an end. The deadening of my spark of hope weakened me. I slid down with my back against the rock, and gave way to despair. As I looked up at the smooth implacable walls that imprisoned me, I felt like some poor insect clinging to the side of a bowl partly filled with water. How frantically the poor creature claws and claws the polished sides, at each effort slipping nearer and nearer to the fatal flood. I had sense enough to know that I was too tired to think profitably, and drowsiness coming over me told me that an hour or two sleep would give me the strength I needed to renew with a will, and more chance of success, my efforts to escape. Light was too precious to waste, so I blew out my lantern, and curling up on the sand almost instantly fell asleep. But before I lapsed into unconsciousness, I had clutched hold of one sustaining thought in the darkness, the assurance of Calypso's safety, so confidently announced by her father. Don't be afraid for her, I know my daughter. But before I lapsed into unconsciousness, I had clutched hold of one sustaining thought in the darkness, the assurance of Calypso's safety so confidently announced by her father. "Don't be afraid for her. I know my daughter. Whatever happened to me, she would come out all right." As her brave shape flashed before my mind's eye, down there under the earth I could have no doubt of that. Chapter 15, in which I pursue my studies as a troglodyte. My instinct had been right in giving way to my drowsiness, for I woke up from my sleep a new man. How long I had been there, of course, I had no means of knowing, but I fancy I must have slept a good while, for I felt so refreshed and full of determination to tackle my escape in good earnest. It is remarkable how rest sharpens one's perceptions. When we are weary, we only half see what we look at, and the very thing we are desperately seeking may be right under our nose, and we quite unaware. So I had hardly relit my lantern when its rays revealed something which it seemed impossible for any one with eyes, however weary, to have overlooked. In the right-hand corner of the little cavern, 5 or 6 feet above my head, was a dark hole, like the entrance to a tunnel, or, more properly speaking, a good-sized burrow, for it was scarcely more than a yard in diameter. It seemed to be something more than a mere cavity in the rock, for, when I flashed my lantern up into it, I could see no end. To climb up to it, at first, seemed difficult, but providentially I had a stout clasp knife in my pocket, and with this I cut a step or two in the porous rock, and so managed it. Lying flat on my stomach, I looked in. It was, as I had thought, a narrow natural tunnel, snaking through the rocks, as often happens in those curious fantastic coral formations, for all the world indeed as if it had been made ages ago by some monstrous primeval serpent, a giant wormhole no less, leading, heaven alone knew where. There was just room to crawl along it on all fours, so I started cautiously, making sure I had my precious matches and my jackknife all safe. After all, I said to myself, I was no worse off than thousands of poor devils in mines. I had myself snaked through just such passages in coal mines. Still, I confess that the choking sense of being shut in this earth-smelling tube like a fox in a drain, and the sudden realization of the appalling tonnage of superincumbent earth above me, liable at any moment to loosen, and, as with a giant thumb, press out my poor little insect existence, made the sweat pour from me, and my heart stand still. I had to shut my eyes for a moment and command myself back to calmness and courage before I could go on. Above all things, I had to blindfold my imagination, the last companion for such a situation. After this first flurry of fear, I went on crawling in a methodical way, allowing no thought to enter my mind that did not concern the yard or two of earth immediately ahead of me. So I progressed, I should say, for some 20 or 30 yards, when, to my inexpressible relief, I came out, still on all fours, onto a spreading floor. Then, standing up, I perceived that I was in a cave of considerable loftiness, and some 40 feet or so across. It was good to breathe again such comparatively free air. Yet, as I looked about and made the circuit of the walls, I saw that I had but exchanged one prison for another. There was this difference, however: whereas there had only been one passageway from the cave I had just left, there were several similar outlets from that in which I now stood. 2 or 3 of them proved to be nothing but alcoves that ran a few yards and then stopped. But there were 2 close by each other which seemed to continue on. There was not much choice between them, but, as both made in the same direction, as far as I could judge of the direction in which I had so far progressed, I decided to take the larger one. It proved to be a passage much like the tunnel I had already traversed, only a little roomier, and therefore it was easier going, and it, too, brought me out, as had the other, on another cavern, but one considerably larger in extent. Here, however, I speedily perceived that it was not a case of one cavern, but several, opening out, by natural archways, one into another. I walked eagerly through them, scanning their ceilings for sign of some outlet into the upper air, but in vain. Still, after the strangling embrace of those tunnels, it was good to have so much space to breathe and walk about in. In fact, I had stumbled on something like a Monte Cristo suite of underground apartments. And here for a moment I released my imagination from her blinders, and allowed her to play around these strange halls. And in one of her suggestions there was some comfort. It was hardly likely that caverns of such extent had waited for me to discover them. They must surely have been known to Teach, or whatever buccaneer it was, who had occupied the ruined mansion not so very far above ground. What better place could be conceived for his business? It was even likely, more than likely, almost certain, that there was some secret passageway connecting this series of caves with the old house, if one could only find it. And so the dear creature prattled on to me until I thought it was time to blindfold her again, and return to business. Still, there was something in what she had said. and I set about them more carefully to examine every nook and corner. And if I didn't find anything so splendid as she had dreamt, I did presently find evidence that, as she had said, I was not the first human being to stand where now I stood. 2 iron staples embedded in one of the walls, with rusting chains and manacles attached, were melancholy proof of one of the uses to which the place had once been put. Melancholy for certain unhappy souls long since free of all mortal chains, but for me, need I say it, exceedingly joyous. For if there had been a way to bring prisoners here, it was none the less evident that there had been a way to take them out. But how and where? Again I searched every nook and cranny. There was no sign of entrance anywhere. Then a thought occurred to me. What if the entrance were after the manner of a medieval oubliette, through the ceiling? There was a thought indeed to send one's hopes soaring. I ran in my eagerness through one cavern after another, holding my lantern aloft. That must be the solution. There could be no other way. I sought and sought, but alas, it was a false hope, and I threw myself down in a corner in despair, deciding that the prisoners must have been forced to crawl in as I had, though it was hardly like jailers to put themselves to such inconvenience. I leaned back against the wall and gazed listlessly upwards. Next moment I had bounded to my feet again. Surely I had seen some short regular lines running up the face of the rock like a ladder. I raised my lantern. Sure enough, there were iron rounds set in the face of the rock, and they mounted up till I lost them in the obscurity, for the cave here must have been 40 feet high. Blessed heaven! I was saved. But alas, they did not begin till some 6 feet above my head, and the wall was sheer. How was I to reach the lowest rung? The rock was too sheer for me to cut steps in, as I had done further back. I looked about me. Again the luck was with me. In one of the caves I had noticed some broken pieces of fallen rock. They were terribly heavy, but despair lent me strength, and after an hour or two's work I had managed to roll several of them to the foot of the ladder, and, with an effort of which I would not have believed myself capable, had been able to build them one on top of another against the wall. So I found myself able to grasp the lowest rung with my hands. Then, fastening the lantern round my neck with my necktie, I prepared to mount. The climb was not difficult, once I had managed to get my feet on the first rung of the ladder, but there was always the chance that one of the rungs might be rusted loose with time, in which case, of course, it would have given way in my grasp, and I should have been precipitated backwards to certain death below. However, the man who had mortised them had done an honest piece of work, and they proved as firm as on the day they were placed there. Up and up I went, till I must have been 40 feet above the floor, and then, as I neared the roof, instead of coming to a trap door as I had conjectured, I found that the ladder came to an end at the edge of a narrow ledge, running along the ceiling much as a clerestory runs near the roof in some old churches. On to this I managed to climb. It was barely a yard wide, and the impending roof did not permit of one standing erect. It was a dizzy situation, and it seemed safest to crawl along on all fours, holding the lantern in front of me. Presently it brought me up sharp in a narrow recess. It had come to an end. Yes, but imagine my joy! It had come to an end at a low archway rudely cut in the rock. Deeply set in the archway was a stout wooden door. My first thought was that I was trapped again, but then, to my infinite surprise and gratitude, it proved to be slightly ajar, and a vigorous push sent it grinding back on its hinges. What next, I wondered? At all events, I was no longer lost in the bowels of the earth. Step by step I was coming nearer to the frontiers of humanity. But I was certainly not prepared for what next met my eyes as I pushed through the low doorway with my lantern and looked around. Yes, indeed, man had certainly been here, man, too, very purposeful and businesslike. I was in a sort of long narrow gallery, some 40 feet long, to which the arching rock made a crypt-like ceiling. At my first glance I saw that there was another door at the far end similar to the one I had entered by, and on the left side of the gallery, built of rough stones from the low ceiling to the floor, was a series of compartments, each with locked wooden door. They were strong and grim looking, and might have been taken for prison cells, or family vaults, or possibly wine bins. The massive locks were red with rust, and there was plainly no possibility of my opening them. On the other side of the gallery there was a litter of old chains, and some boards, probably left over from the doors. Yes, and there were 2 old flint-lock guns, and several cutlasses, all eaten away with rust, also a rough seaman's chest open and falling to pieces. At the sight of that a wild thought flashed through my brain. What if, good God, what if this was John Teach's treasury, behind those grim doors? I threw myself with all my force against one of them and then the other. For the moment I forgot that my paramount business was to escape, but I might as well have hurled myself against a solid rock. And, at that moment, I noticed that the place was darker than it had been. My lantern was going out. In a moment or two I should be in the pitch dark, and I had discovered that the door at the end of the gallery was as solid as the others. I was to be trapped after all, and I pictured myself slowly dying there of hunger, the pangs of which I was already beginning to feel, and some one, years hence, finding me there, a mouldering skeleton, some one who would break open those doors, discover those gleaming hoards, and moralize on the irony of my end, condemned to die there of starvation with the treasure I had so long sought on the other side of those unyielding doors. Old Tom's words suddenly flashed over me, and I could feel my hair literally beginning to rise. There never was a buried treasure yet that didn't claim its victim. Great God! And I was to be the ghost, and keep guard in this terrible tomb till the next dead man came along to relieve me of my sentry duty. Frantically I turned up the wick of my lantern at the thought, but it was of no use. It was plainly going out. I examined my matchbox. I still had a dozen or so matches left, and then my eye fell on that shattered chest. There were those boards too. At all events, I could build a fire and make torches of slivers of wood, so long as the wood lasted. Then I had an idea. Why not make the fire against the door at the end of the gallery, and so burn my way through? Bravo! My spirits rose at the thought, and I set to at once splitting some small kindling with my knife. In a few minutes I had quite a sprightly little fire going at the bottom of the door, but I saw that I should have to be extravagant with my wood if the fire was to be effective. However, it was neck or nothing, so I piled on beams and boards till my fire roared like a furnace, and presently I had the joy of seeing it begin to take hold of the door, which, after a short time, began to crackle and splutter in a very cheering fashion. Whatever lay beyond, it was evident that I should soon be able to break my way through the obstacle, and indeed so it proved, for presently I used one of the boards as a battering ram, and to my inexpressible joy it went crashing through with a shower of sparks, and it was but the work of a few more minutes before the whole door fell flaming down, and I was able to leap through the doorway into the darkness on the other side. As I stood there, peering ahead, and holding aloft a burning stick, which proved, however, a poor substitute for my lantern, a wonderful sound smote my ears. I could not believe it, and my knees shook beneath me. It was the sound of the sea. Yes! It was no illusion. It was the sound that the sea makes singing and echoing through hollow caves, the sound I heard that night as I stood in the moonlight door of Calypso's cavern, and saw that vision which my heart nearly broke to remember. Calypso! Oh, Calypso, where was she at this moment? Pray God that she was indeed safe, as her father had said, but I had to will her from my mind to keep from going mad. And my poor torch had gone out, having, however, given me light enough to see that the door which I had just burnt through led out on to a narrow platform on the side of a rock that went slanting down into a chasm of blackness, through which, as in a great shell, boomed that murmuring of the sea. It had a perilous, ugly look, and it was plain that it would be foolhardy to attempt it at that moment without a light, and my fire was dying down. Besides, I was beginning to feel light-headed and worn out, partly from lack of food, no doubt. As there was no food to be had, I recalled the old French proverb, "He eats who sleeps," or something to that effect, and I determined to husband my strength once more with a brief rest. However, as I turned to throw some more wood on my fire, preparing to indulge myself with a little camp-fire cheerfulness as I dozed off, my eyes fell once more upon that grim line of locked doors, and my curiosity and an idea made me wakeful again. I had burned down one door, why not another? Why not, indeed? So I raked over my fire to the family vault nearest to me, and presently had it roaring and licking against the stout door. It was, apparently, not so solid as the gallery door had been. At all events, it kindled more easily, and it was not long before I had the satisfaction of battering that down too. As I did so, I caught sight of something in the interior that made me laugh aloud, and behave generally like a madman. Of course, I didn't believe my eyes, but they persisted in declaring, nevertheless, that there in front of me was a great iron-bound oaken chest to begin with. It might not, of course, contain anything but bones, but it might. The thing was too absurd. I must have fallen asleep, must be already dreaming. But no, I was laboring with all my strength to open it with one of the rusty cutlasses. It was a tough job, but my strength was as the strength of 10, for the old treasure-hunting lust was upon me, and I had forgotten everything else in the world. At last, with a great wooden groan, as though its heart were breaking at having to give up its secret at last, it crashed open. I fell upon my knees as though I had been struck by lightning, for it was literally brimming over with silver and gold pieces, doubloons and pieces of 8, English and French coins too, guineas and louis d'or, all, as Tobias's manuscript had said, all good money. For a while I knelt over it, dazed and blinded, lost, Then I slowly plunged my hands into it, and let the pieces pour and pour through them, literally bathing them in gold and silver, as I had read of misers doing. Meanwhile I talked insanely to myself, made all sorts of inarticulate noises, sang shreds of old songs. Rising at length, I capered up and down the gallery, talking aloud to the king as though he had been there, and anon breaking out again into absurd song, roaring it at the top of my voice, laughing and war-whooping between. There was chest on chest of Spanish gold, with a ton of plate in the middle hold, and the cabin's riot of loot untold. Then suddenly I broke out into an Irish jig, never having any notion of doing such a thing before. In fact, I behaved as I have read of men doing, whom a sudden fortune has bereft of reason. For the time, at all events, I was a gibbering madman. Certainly there was to be no sleep for me that night. But in the full tide of my frenzy I suddenly noticed something that brought me up sharp. Out beyond the doorway it was growing light. It was only a dim, tremulous diffusion of it, indeed, but it was real daylight, oozing in from somewhere or other, the blessed, blessed daylight! God be praised. End of chapters 14 and 15 from Book 3 of Pieces of Eight by Richard Le Gallienne. Recording by Todd.